we had the so-called, Judeo-Christian ethic, right? And more or less in the early 1900s up through the 60s and more or less, we shared a common kind of language. I mean, schools, taught certain things, families, for the most part, right? I mean, there was a certain way of understanding. If I would have talked about Abraham or Joseph or Jesus, most people in the country would have at least, whether they were Jewish, Christian, secular, Hindu, I mean, most people would have known the kind of common language. There was sort of a general American narrative, an American story. So I just returned from a 14-day trip to Palestine, Israel, where our group of 18 met with Jewish, Christian, and Muslim human rights activists. You can see us with Isa on the left, and you can see us with Fadwa Barghouti on the right, in front of a picture of her husband, Marwan Barghouti. Marwan Barghouti is called the Palestinian Nelson Mandela, and he's been in prison for over 20 years. And Fadwa herself is an activist. So there we are. We'll have a chance to talk more about what we experienced again on June the 12th. But one of the words that kept coming up again and again was narrative. How Israel has controlled and how Israel has sold the world a narrative. Biblical Israel, chosen Israel, democratic Israel, God's Israel versus a hostile Palestinian Muslim world intent on destroying it. But we heard a different narrative. We heard it from Jews and Christians and Muslims, Israel as an apartheid, ethnic cleansing, genocidal, settler colonial enterprise that's been part of the Zionist agenda from the very beginning, already in the mid-1800s. In 2012, Barack Obama was asked if he'd made any mistakes during his first term in office. He declined to name any policy decisions. Instead, he talked about the story he didn't tell. The mistake of my first term was thinking that this job was about getting the policy right. And that's important, but he said, the nature of this office is also to tell a story to the American people that gives them a sense of unity and purpose and optimism. Next. This story is what scholars call civil religion. American civil religion uses Jewish and Christian scriptures and symbols to provide a sacred legitimization to the political, economic, and social order. Again, it uses Jewish and Christian language, but it's not Judaism, nor is it Christianity. Sociologist Robert Bellah defines civil religion this way. American civil religion has its own prophets and martyrs. I mean, think about this. It's secular, but it has its own prophets and martyrs, its own sacred events and sacred places. Think about like the Vietnam Memorial Wall, right? It's a secular, but it's a sacred place, right? But it's in a secular way. Its own solemn rituals and symbols. It's concerned that America be a society as perfectly in accord with the will of God as can be made, and a light to all the nations. Next. We're almost at 20 months of Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza and the West Bank. Why does the U.S. support Israel so uncritically? Well, much has been written about the role of the religious right's Christian Zionism and its end-time theology, as well as the Israel lobby's hold on the conscience of America. But why is that? Here's my thesis for the evening. And remember, while it uses the Bible and Christian and Jewish language, America's civil religion is neither Jewish, nor Christian. Next. Central to America's civic creed is the belief that American democracy, capitalism, and culture are the peak of God's ordained Western culture. Next. There's an intimate connection between God, the progress of Western civilization, American culture, and Israeli dominance in the Middle East. Lots of folks are talking about Christian nationalism today. The Unitarian Universalist congregation, for example, is beginning a movement about critiquing Christian nationalism. Well, I'm connecting it with Israel. American exceptionalism equals Israeli exceptionalism. They're the same. They come out of the same root. Next. This sense of being blessed by God is not unique to America, but what is unique about America's civic creed is its sense of chosenness. Chosenness for mission. It's messianic. It's to be a light to all the nations. Next. So America's civic creed links America's self-ordained universal mission, its manifest destiny, that God has plans for the world and America is God's agent, with the biblical story of God's plan for the biblical Israelites and Israel's manifest destiny in the Holy Land. American exceptionalism and Israeli exceptionalism, America's manifest destiny and Israel's manifest destiny are all one. Next. So what I'm saying, or what I'm hoping to give examples of, is that uniquely in our country's history, we took the biblical story of God's chosen people, Israel, and applied it to ourselves, God's chosen people, America. And with all of its exceptionalist, racist, colonizing baggage, it became our civil religious narrative, this manifest destiny, what Conrad Cherry calls the great American motivational myth. It's our real religion. It's our real religion. America's civic creed baked into our American consciousness. I mean, we grow up in elementary schools and just sort of by osmosis, it's built into us. And I believe, I contend, that it underlies most Christian Zionism. So the Christian Zionists might have this end-time theology, but really what underlies that, the foundation of it, is America's civic creed. This underlying narrative, as we recently heard in Palestine and Israel, that's the real story. And I'm going to just choose a few examples. I could have chosen dozens, but I'm going to just choose a few examples to make the point. Next. And next. William Bradford was the first governor of the Plymouth colony, 1621 to 1651, who read the Old Testament in its original Hebrew. He connected the Pilgrims with the biblical Israelites in their exoduses, exiles, land restoration. They were all one and the same. New England, in reality, was the New Jerusalem for William Bradford, populated by the elect and bound by a covenant. Notice this biblical language, but for a secular entity, bound by a covenant of race, piety, and mission. Next. Puritan minister and Harvard president Increase Mather described Bradford as an Abraham, whom God called out of the Ur, not the Ur of the Chaldees, right, but the Ur of England. That's what he said. His son, Puritan minister, and by the way, an enabler of the so-called Salem witch trials, uppity women. Can't have that. Cotton Mather, his son, called him Moses. And his writings were called, quote, a New England Old Testament, a Genesis, Exodus, and Joshua of the Pilgrim plantation, of the Plymouth plantation. Next. Increase Mather believed that a Jewish Christian Jerusalem would be the epicenter for the inauguration of Christ's millennial reign, and described the Puritan settlers' central historic role, sermonizing in one of his sermons, quote, there never was a generation that did so perfectly shake off the dust of Babylon. Was there ever a place so like unto New Jerusalem as New England hath been? Next. And next. So on the 1st of July, 1776, the delegates to the Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia. They learned of the appearance of 100 British ships, the first of 400 in all, off the coast of New York. Next. 3 days later, on the 4th of July, 1776, the 4th of July, 1776, the Continental Congress Assembly appointed John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson to, quote, bring in a device for a seal of the United States of America. They chose an artist, Pierre-Eugène du Soumiatre, to work with them, and by mid-August, each brought to the committee his own proposal for the new nation's seal. Next. Ironically, Adams, who was the Calvinist, chose a secular theme from antiquity, but the two deists, Franklin and Jefferson, chose a biblical theme, although the latter also incorporated an Anglo-Saxon image. Jefferson suggested that there should be depicted on the front of the seal, quote, the children of Israel in the wilderness, led by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And Franklin's proposal equally referenced the Israelites being chased by Pharaoh into the parting waters of the Red Sea. And these were all combined together, and the final proposal as it was submitted, although it was ultimately rejected, was that on the reverse side of the Great Seal there would be, next, Pharaoh sitting in an open chariot, a crown on his head and a sword in his hand, passing through the divided waters of the Red Sea in pursuit of the Israelites. Rays from a pillar of fire and a cloud, expressive of the divine presence and command, beaming on Moses, who stands on the shore and extending his hand over the sea, causing it to overwhelm Pharaoh. This is what the two deists recommended. Next. The motto that Franklin proposed, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. So since its first colonial settlements, America's most popular, most important guiding myth has been this manifest destiny, the myth of courageous pioneers chosen by God to tame and missionize an uncivilized other, both land, an uncivilized land, and people. What's unique about the American narrative is its political, economic, and religious appropriation of an exceptionalist interpretation of God's covenant with biblical Israel. Next. In 1783, Congregationalist minister and Yale College president Ezra Stiles described the early Pilgrims as forging God's American Israel, high above all the nations which he hath made, vanquishing the indigenous native population who he called pagan Canaanites, called the Native Americans pagan Canaanites. And in 1788, His fellow Congregationalist minister and Harvard College president, Samuel Langdon, said that the ancient Republic of the Israelites was an example to the American states. In our day, instead of the 12 tribes of Israel, we can substitute the 13 states of the American Union. Already built in from the very founding of the country. You can see this thread, and it's going to continue to the present day. Next. Next. In the 19th century, Christian Zionist end times theology arose in Britain with John Nelson Darby. You know, we forget about this, right? That Christian Zionism precedes Jewish Zionism. Thank you. Christian Zionism comes first in the UK and Great Britain. In the United States, with the Scofield Bible. If you were brought up as an evangelical, you know the Scofield Bible pretty well. Also, the U.S. turned its eyes westward, euphemistically calling it westward expansion. I'm from St. Louis, and the museum under the arch is called the Museum of the Westward Expansion, Lewis and Clark, etc. Westward expansion symbolized by John Gass' 1872 American Progress. Publisher George Crowfoot, who commissioned this painting, gushed, "America, Columbia, floats westward through the air with the star of empire on her forehead. Fleeing her approach are Indians, buffalo, wild horses, bears, and other game, disappearing into the storm and waves of the Pacific coast. They flee this wondrous vision. The star is too much for them." Next. And in 1845, pre-Civil War North journalist and slavery defender John O'Sullivan coined the term in 1845, manifest destiny, which blended together apocalyptic fervor, Christian missionary zeal, colonizing foreign policy, and empire building. God's new Israel is now planted on American soil, and it's now become new imperial Rome, a beneficent, a merciful imperialism. Let's call it compassionate conservatism. Next. Here's author Herman Melville in his 1850 White Jacket, the year before Moby Dick was published. God has predestinated great things for the American race. The rest of the nations must soon be in our rear. We are the pioneers of the world, the advance guard, sent on through the wilderness of untried things to break a new path in the new world that's ours. But the political Messiah has come in us. And let's always remember that with ourselves, almost for the first time in history, in the history of the earth, get this, national selfishness is unbounded philanthropy. Next. And in 1861, this martial colonial zeal is at its highest. The same year, by the way, that the Battle Hymn of the Republic was written. Puritan minister George S. Phillips wrote presciently about America's divine imperial calling. Our mission should only be accomplished when the last despot should be dethroned, the last chain of oppression broken, the dignity and equality of redeemed humanity everywhere acknowledged, Republican government everywhere established, and the American flag should wave over every land and encircle the world with its majestic folds. Then, and not until then, should the nation have accomplished the purpose for which it was established by the God of heaven. You see this messianic, I mean, it's messianic, right? This messianic fervor. Not surprisingly, this time of manifest destiny, supported by a rise of biblical prophecy and fundamentalist Christian Zionist dispensationalist theology, it saw a rise in Christian pilgrimage, most specifically Protestant missions, to what they began to all again call the Holy Land. So Christian missions in the 19th century really just burgeoned. Next. I'll simply mention physician James T. Barclay, who in 1851, the American Christian Missionary Society sent as their first missionary to Jerusalem. He authored, I mean, it's a famous book, right? The City of the Great King, Jerusalem as it was, as it is, and it is to be, in 1858. It's an interesting read. It's part geography manual, part missionary guide, and part theological treatise. Next. Barclay believed that the New Jerusalem was to be found geographically precisely on the site of biblical Zion. Contemporary Jerusalem, the calling of the Christian West, was to create it as it is to be. So it was to take the Jerusalem that was, and create it as it was meant to be. And this meant the conversion of Jews, for, quote, for upon the conversion and resumption of Israel is unquestionably suspended the destruction of Antichrist and the salvation of the world. Think of this not so subtle anti-Semitism here masked by supposed admiration for the Jews. And that's really the flaw, right, of Christian Zionist theology. They purport to love the Jews, but they're really anti-Semitic because at the end when the Messiah appears, the Jews either go away or convert. Next. He rationalized that because of Jewish influence around the world, if converted, they would aid Christian mission. Rothschild wealth, Disraeli political shrewdness, Moses Montefiore's philanthropy, and more. Next. So this is what Barclay wrote. The Hebrew race is the noblest that has ever adorned the annals of humanity, and that will not be questioned. Nor can it be doubted that if converted, speaking as they do all the languages of the earth, habituated to all its customs, and acclimated to every region, they would make the best missionaries on the face of the globe. And all this culminating in the words of Lord Balfour, Prime Minister of England at the turn of the 20th century, 1902 to 1905, and author of the so-called Balfour Declaration. The universalization of Western culture, its manifest destiny for, quote, next, the general welfare of mankind, for the West around the globe, especially in the Holy Land. Imperialism had become altruistic. Imperialism had become altruistic. So here's our friend, we just saw him at church a couple Sundays ago, Bethlehem theologian and pastor Mitri Raheb. The bond between the state of Israel and the United States is of a strategic, political, and military nature, grounded in the common belief of being a chosen people as a settler community called to rule. Imperialism as altruistic. We're going to keep coming back to that. Next, please. And next. So I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, and you heard about the tornado that just touched down recently, a week or so ago in the city. It's kind of unheard of in St. Louis, but touched down near Forest Park. Those of you who have been in St. Louis know that that's the home of the zoo and the art museum and all kinds of other, the jewel box. and the History Museum, and the Municipal Opera. 120 years ago, 1 year after Chicago's Parliament of World Religions, 7 years after the first Zionist Congress, part of the Louisiana Exposition celebrating the 100th anniversary of Thomas Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase. So, the 1904 World's Fair, next. The 1904 World's Fair was recreated in, back one please, Nikita. Was recreated a full 1-to-1 scale. Next. Quote, the wonderful reproduction of the most interesting city in the world, Jerusalem, where every attraction was free. Next. I did some research on this in the St. Louis History Museum back in the day, and it's just really fascinating about the St. Louis World's Fair. It's a 1-to-1 reproduction. So they built the old city of Jerusalem in Forest Park, and every attraction is free. Next. There was the Jews' Wailing Wall and the Muslims' Mosque of Omar, with 5 times a day call to prayer. This 12-acre recreated Jerusalem had 22 winding streets with bazaars, goats, sheep, and camels. 1,100 Muslim and Christian Jerusalemites were brought by steamer and train to St. Louis to sell their wares, cook indigenous foods, play their music, dance, all clothed in colorful costumes. Next. Native guides with tours every 10 minutes to take you through exhibits meant for a white Western tourist pilgrims seen through a romanticized Orientalist view of the Holy Land, what Eric Davis from Rutgers calls, quote, a cult of masculinity with, quote, life in the harem and a Bedouin sword dance.
Wow.
Next. There was the rock on which Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac. Scenes from the life of Jesus, the temple where he taught, the Via Dolorosa. There was a diorama of the Mount of Olives, including the Garden of Gethsemane, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre with, quote, a lecture every hour by a sheikh of Jerusalem. Next. Solomon's temple, Moses' tabernacle, Bethlehem's manger, where you can watch the wise men visit the baby Jesus, and a Bedouin encampment, quote, illustrating the way Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived. And the creme de la creme, the cyclorama of the crucifixion, which, according to the promotional materials, was, quote, worth the whole price of admission to Jerusalem. And all comers were assured that they would find, see at the bottom, commodious, clean toilet rooms, and all free.
Worth the price of admission, though.
Next, but it's, saying, it's just worth coming. And towering over this holy city, a 26-story Ferris wheel. Next. This recreated Jerusalem exhibit was endorsed by over 500 banks and trust companies. It was in St. Louis it was in the St. Louis magazine, The Jewish Tablet, and they recently reported, quote, a way to include faith, religious belief within the panoply of modern American values. The fair was designed to celebrate progress, know-how, gumption. That this display promised its investors Substantial returns on their investment didn't hurt either. A testament to both American ingenuity and overweening confidence. Jerusalem, the St. Louis Fair, as souvenir postcards put it, was even thought to be, quote, a mighty improvement over the real thing. Next. Burke O. Long, in Imagining the Holy Land, quotes fair organizers that, like the Louisiana Purchase itself, this was an homage to America, the true meaning of Israel in America's civic creed, America's righteousness and progressive achievements, westward territorial expansion, energetic capitalism, controlled democracy, business competition, entrepreneurial invention, and populist education. A vigorous United States enthroned as the vanguards of civilization, democratic liberty, and cultural progress. She was heir to God's blessings bestowed on the world through ancient Jerusalem. America was heir to God's blessing bestowed on the world through ancient Jerusalem. Or finally, as Jewish philanthropist turned Mormon, Madame Lydia von Finkelstein-Mountford, who was the director of exhibits at the fair, told tour groups, next, you cannot go to Jerusalem, so Jerusalem comes to you. To American energy, all things are possible. That encapsulates the thesis of the evening. Now, I'm going to make just a little bit of an aside. Next, please. We have to mention, and it's much too brief here, it deserves much more, the work of Edward Said and his landmark Orientalism, which calls out the West's seemingly benign but inherently racist views of non-white Eastern and specifically Middle Eastern culture. Next. Not only is the West's vision of Israel romanticized, but also its own history. I mean, just think about the current political and religious right's attempt at erasing its history of violence against women and people of color and others from schools and journalists who tell the truth and the others in the public arena. The West pictures itself as progressive, civilized, moral, democratic, and the East, sometimes subtly, sometimes not so much, the East as backward, fanatical, and immoral, in need of intervention politically, culturally, and religiously. At the heart of Christian Zionism is not so much a love for Israel, but a racist white Christian nationalism and their end times theology, which is all about power and domination. Next. Add to this that most Americans' view of Palestine and Israel is of a biblical holy land. Sunday school Bible stories as their primary lens for geopolitical understanding. Sunday school materials as their glasses through which they view geopolitics. In schools and in the media, we see a romanticized version of Western civilization and American history. And in our churches, a romanticized version of mythical biblical Israel that has little to do with the Palestinians, including Palestinian Christians, indigenous people, indigenous to the land who actually lived there. Next. Palestine becomes a historical oddity on ancient maps, the site of Holy Land pilgrimages where you visit the holy stones but never meet any of the living stones. Here's some of the folks we met just the last few weeks, 19 meetings in 13 days. Many of them have been here in this room, and many of them you know personally. And the Holy Land gets turned into a Jewish Christian fantasy Bible land where no Palestinians exist, Muslim or Christian, or ever did exist, a land without a people, for a people without a land. You know, I was there last February and March, and since then, they were going to build a, what do you call it, sky lift? They were planning to build a sky lift from Silwan, which is a neighborhood right outside the old city, into this biblical theme park that they want to build, the city of David, right outside and inside the old city of Jerusalem. Well, they don't have the sky lift there now, but they have a big bridge. So they removed some Palestinian homes in Silwan. Now it's a big picnic area for some of the Jewish Israelis from West Jerusalem. In fact, there were a whole bunch of children and families picnicking there when we were there. And you can see them walking across the bridge into the Jewish quarter of the old city on this massive bridge that they built. I believe, I contend that what and how children and adults are taught in churches and in Sunday schools particularly, even progressive churches, really, and it's the progressive churches that piss me off the most, forgive me, that anger me the most. This is where this dangerous Christianized version of manifest destiny actually begins. It's the way we teach. It's the way we teach Sunday school, the Bible stories. So that when we look at the news about what's happening in Palestine and Israel, they can't help but overlay it with a version of the Holy Land that prioritizes an idealized version of biblical Israel as God's chosen people. And America now too, overlaid on today's political reality. But all that's for another time. Next. And next. It's no wonder then that we find a bipartisan succession of U.S. presidents and other political leaders supporting the modern secular state of Israel because of this civic creed, this American civil religion. Here's a few examples. You see, right? Lyndon Johnson said the Israelis reminded him of Texas fighting Mexico. Next one. Jimmy Carter's 2006 Palestine Peace Not Apartheid, while it suggested that Israel's treatment of West Bank Palestinians could be a system of apartheid, it still held Israel as a democracy for its citizens. His support for Israel never wavered, based upon his evangelical view of Israel as God's chosen people, who he wanted to fulfill their biblical mandate. However, in his post-presidency, he became a fervent supporter of Palestine within the framework of a two-state solution. And I'll just simply say that in my lifetime, he was probably the greatest, even with all of his, the boundaries to his thinking because of his evangelical worldview, is probably the greatest supporter of the Palestinian cause. I have just the highest respect for Jimmy Carter. Next one. Ronald Reagan combined his fascination with end-time theology. And that's kind of an underreported story about Reagan. His connection with end-time theology. He connected that with his evil empire anti-communist activism. So on March 19th, 1984, he invited 150 evangelical leaders, including some of your friends, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, and others to the White House to receive briefings. They came to receive briefings on Middle East policy and to weigh in themselves, among the briefers was Colonel Oliver North. Next. For evangelical George W. Bush, Iraq replaced Russia as the new Babylon. It was literally the ancient Babylon, by the way, but that somehow that bypassed him.
You think you knew that?
I'm sorry?
You think you knew that fact? I doubt it.
It colored his support for Israel. His pastor, Mark Craig, called Bush in an inauguration sermon, quote, Moses, who just crossed the river, leading his people to the mountain and from there to the promised land. Notre Dame's Scott Appleby described Bush's presidency as, quote, a theological version of manifest destiny. Next. Early in his presidency, June 6, 2009, Barack Obama gave a landmark speech in Cairo, offering an olive branch to the Islamic world, and just as important, while reminding the audience of America's special relationship with Israel, he did offer that, quote, America will not turn our backs on the legitimate Palestinian aspiration for dignity, opportunity, and a state of their own. I reread his Cairo speech. I guess it was Tuesday this week. Read that speech. His Cairo speech in 2009. But of course, that's why Obama was such a great disappointment to the Palestinian people. Over 8 years, Obama not only disappointed Palestinian aspirations, but he signed the United States-Israel Enhanced Security Cooperation Act and increased military aid to Israel from $3.2 billion annually to $3.8 billion annually. Now, to be fair, he didn't veto a United Nations Security Council resolution at the end of his second term, demanding an end to Israeli settlements on Palestinian territory, allowing it to pass easily. So that was a real plus at the end of the second term. But you talk to Palestinians, and they'll tell you that what great dreams they had for themselves when Obama came to office, especially based on his Cairo speech, and then just the deflation that occurred over 8 years. Next, this isn't the president, but he's one of your own, one of our own, so I thought I would just share. Vice President Mike Pence, his 2018 speech to Israel's Knesset, this really encapsulates, right, this understanding of America's civic creed. In the story of the Jews, we see the story of America. It's a story of an exodus, a journey from persecution to freedom, the power of faith and the promise of hope. My country's very first settlers also saw themselves as pilgrims sent by providence to build a new promised land. And by the way, you remember, what was it, about a year ago when Pence visited Israel last, you saw him at a kibbutz up in the north, writing his name on a missile, a bomb that was to be dropped onto Gaza. Next one. I am a Zionist, Joe Biden proudly stated. Israel is in my heart. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel. All the while, this criminal supplied tens of billions of dollars of weapons to Israel, criminally complicit in the genocide Israel's perpetrating in Gaza and the West Bank now too. Next one. And then we come to the current White House occupant. According to Alexandra Cohen, a journalist, Donald Trump created a new kind of civil religion, a new kind of civil faith, quote, that holds conservatism, whiteness, and Christianity as a holy trinity of the real American identity, with himself as the object of worship. Next, telling evangelical audiences and reinforced by evangelical pastors and other leaders that he was, quote, chosen by God. Next, this is a wonderful article in the Atlantic magazine, well-researched and documented. July 2024, McKay Coppins wrote how he did this so that we wouldn't have to. He reviewed all 58 prayers prayed at Trump rallies since he announced in November 2022. Trump's name is mentioned more than Jesus, 87 to 61. the vehicle by which the covenant between God and America, now broken, will be reestablished. If America repents of its socialist, gay-friendly, woke agenda. Next. I think it's been interesting as a scholar of religion, how progressives can't understand how evangelicals could embrace Trump, who violates their Christian family values. In 2020, he was compared, this is how they do it. In 2020, he was compared to the 6th century BCE pagan Persian king Cyrus the Great. He was a pagan, but he was used by God to liberate the Hebrew people from Babylonian captivity, reestablish them in the land, and rebuild the temple. So it wasn't Trump's character, but his anointing. That's how they describe it. We know Trump's character, but his anointing by God, that's what they observe, that's what they see, and that's what they respect. That's how they describe it. Next one. And that was the first term. This time around, there's no mention of Cyrus. Instead, Trump compares himself, and his minions do, to Israel's righteous, biblical, heroic warrior kings, Solomon and David, and a militant, macho Jesus who issues the call, onward Christian soldiers, and taps into the myth, America's myth, of the solitary John Wayne-like hero fighting evil. So this solitary John Wayne figure that resonates right in the American psyche. Next.
You buy those combines?
I can sell them to you too. And next.
Oh.
But you can see, right, how this, how this fits into this, the Bruce Willis and Arnold Schwarzenegger and, the old westerns that, you watch as a child, Shane, the lone, solitary, heroic figure fighting against the forces of evil. And now you wed that with some of the biblical warriors and warrior kings, and all of a sudden you got this amalgamation of biblical Israel and the American myth. Next. And next. So we have the origin story, the belief that the taming and settlement of a largely uninhabited land was God ordained. That's the origin story. A brave, pioneering people escaped from religious and political oppression in Egypt or in Europe. They meet great obstacles in realizing their dreams of a free land for a free people in an untamed wilderness. Next. They overcome the savages, natives, Native Americans, Canaanites, present-day Palestinians. Notice how they all blend together. Who use terror to try to thwart their divine mission. But with God's help, these brave settlers defeat the savages, force them off the land, forging a way to make the wilderness blossom and flourish. Next. Some of them believed in a spiritual recreation of Zion that needed the conversion of the Jews. Others believed that simply the physical return to the land held the key to bringing forth the end time. But all of them believed the restoration of the land joined a specific form of American politics, entrepreneurial capitalism, cultural and intellectual Orientalism, and evangelical spirituality, a conflation of America as God's New Jerusalem, the New Jerusalem as it was meant to be, and Jerusalem recreated in American popular Protestant piety, all undergirding America's civil religion, its unconscious Zionist civic creed. Christian nationalism, manifest destiny, Zionism, blended together becomes American civil religion. So we come full circle from the 17th century Pilgrims settling in the new American Israel to the Zionist Organization of America planted articles in American newspapers describing the Zionist pioneers as modern day version of American settlers. So it comes full circle. Next. For example, in the June 11th, 1922 New York Times, these immigrants to Palestine are Jewish Puritans. Their settlements are the Jamestown and Plymouth of the new house of Israel. They are, quote, building the new Judea, even as the Puritans built New England. The settlers are like, quote, the followers of Daniel Boone, who opened the West for American settlers, while, quote, facing the dangers of Indian warfare, and in the process, quote, the Jews are bringing prosperity and happiness in Palestine. So the first settlers to this land were like the original Jews, right, settling Canaan. Now, the Jews expelling the Palestinians and resettling the land of Israel use the American settlers as their model to discuss how they're settling the land of Palestine. Next. Or in the words of St. Louis World's Fair Director of Exhibits, Madame von Finkelstein Montford, the generative core of human progress is God's work, and a vocation of shimmering brightness emboldened by the song of American destiny, ever marching toward the messianic kingdom for which Christians wait. Next. How unsurprising, then, that at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, 4 decades before the founding of the State of Israel, 4 decades before the founding of the State of Israel, along with those of all the nations of the world, flying silently yet tellingly over the fairground, was the white and blue Zionist flag. Next. And next. So this, I'm just going to take a couple minutes and then I'll wrap this up, but is there another way? Is it possible, given how deeply ingrained American and Israeli exceptionalism is in the American psyche and in the American story, is it possible to reframe, is it possible to disrupt the narrative? Are there other sources within our tradition that critique such a narrow, messianic, nationalist, imperialistic view? Well, the answer is yes, but I want to just make sure that I'm clearer than I just was. So we just followed this thread from America's founding all the way through to the present day of this narrow, Zionist, racist, exceptionalist civil religion. Is that the only civil religion that's built into our foundations? And the answer is no. Next one. Princeton sociologist Robert Wolfnow describes 2 American civil religions, a conservative one that embraces America as God's chosen nation, its special place in the divine order, that equates capitalist principles and biblical teaching and is called to evangelize the world, and a liberal one that focuses less on the nation and more. Back one, Nikki. Thank you, Annie. Focuses less on the nation and more on humanity. That, quote, America has a vital role to play in world affairs, not because it's the home of a chosen people, but because it has a responsibility to help alleviate the world's problems. To whom much is given, right? To whom much is given, So many of which, to help alleviate the world's problems, many of which it has caused, and therefore is concerned with human rights, justice, and peace. So these two different civil religions, from the very foundations of America, they run as tributaries side by side through our history. Next one. Robert Jewett and John Shelton Lawrence talk about, quote, two tributaries that run from the pages of the Bible down through American history. The first one they call zealous nationalism, that seeks to redeem the world by destroying enemies, that incorporates the conspiracy theory of evil, stereotyping enemies, the mystique of violence, obsession with victory, and the worship of national symbols such as flags. The second one they call prophetic realism, that seeks to redeem the world for coexistence by impartial justice and the rule of law, with no favored status for individual nations, that incorporates the impartial institutions of justice, embodying international law, the covenant of the United Nations, understanding that basic human rights and responsibilities are universal. That is a globally focused civil religion, a globally focused civil religion. And that too is part of our history as a country. Next one. In the United States, perhaps the most eloquent spokesperson for this second view was Martin Luther King Jr. When I used to teach this stuff, I used to, Lincoln was another one who embodied this second perspective. He spoke in his Nobel laureate lecture in December 1964, and then again in a speech at the invitation of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel 10 days before he was killed. He spoke of a biblical oikos, O-I-K-O-S, a world house, from which we derive the words ecology and ecumenical and others. We have inherited a big house, a great world house in which we have to live together. Black and white, Easterners and Westerners, Gentiles and Jews, Catholics and Protestants, Muslim and Hindu, a family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interests, who, because we can never again live without each other, must learn somehow in this one big world to live with each other. We must now give an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole to preserve the best in our individual societies. The call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all people. You see the two strands, right? Or in the words of my former boss, go ahead, Nikki. This is King Hussein's brother, Prince Al Hassan bin Talal, in his keynote address. I worked in his, I was a speechwriter and researcher for Prince Hassan in Amman in 1998-99. He's probably one of the 2 or 3 wisest individuals I've ever met. His keynote address to the participants of the Second World Congress for Middle East Studies, June 2006. In this age of informatics, we have abundance of virtual reality, but not enough virtuous reality, a human dignity deficit. The bombs we face are not just chemical, biological, or nuclear. Rather, the terror we face is poverty, the depletion of environmental resources, imperial domination, prejudice and intolerance, and most importantly of all, fundamentalist ideologies and fundamentalist religion. We must stop thinking of ourselves as Muslim and Jewish and Christian tribes and begin thinking of ourselves as one common humanity under God, created by God in God's image and committed to all God's creation. I mean, he's speaking right as a pious Muslim man. We need domestic and foreign policy shaped no longer by unilateral militarism, but rather by a multilateral humanitarianism. No longer a unilateral militarism, but by a multilateral humanitarianism. So, final one. Myths matter. The story, the narrative that we tell matters. Underlying most people's religious beliefs, when I used to teach, the kids would tell me what religion they were, and I always told them I never believe it. I never believe somebody when they tell me what religion they are, because there's always something underneath that underlies it, I think. Psychology of religion is really important. Underlying most people's religious beliefs is their true religion. It's their worldview, their value system. And the same is true for nations. It's not only about pushing back against a heretical Christian Zionist theology, but disrupting the racist American exceptionalist ideology underlying it. The problem is that it's been a part of our national myth, the American story in the public square. It's our civic creed baked into our American consciousness, not only from our founding, but into our children, into ourselves from when we were children. I mean, almost we learned it from, we get it by osmosis from their very beginnings as children. These two different worldviews, these two different civic religions, vie for supremacy since our founding as a nation. We have a better American narrative, one that's more inclusive, more democratic, more pluralistic, more global in its understanding. I'm gonna say this Sunday's sermon, this coming Sunday's sermon. Diversity, equity, inclusivity, DEI has never been popular, but it's the truth. But it's the future. It's the future. Compassion, it's never been popular out in the real world. It's tough out there. But it's the truth. It's the way forward. It's the way forward for us. It's the future if we want to live together. That's our mission, to tell this other story, this new story, this more inclusive story, and to implement it in every aspect of our culture. And, they call it the seven hills or seven mountains in this dominionist theology that's at the base of Project 2025 and the religious rights embrace of that. And so they have these seven hilltops, these seven mountains that they want to conquer in American life: home, church, school, politics and government, arts and entertainment, business, and technology. So those are the ballparks that these folks in Project 2025 are playing in and trying to dominate, trying to take control of. Well, we can do that with a better story, with a more inclusive story. And that's our mission. Thanks for coming tonight. And you've been very patient, but there is some time for questions if you'd like to ask some questions or make some comments. Tony?
We did the checkpoint. Have you been to Jerusalem? Back in Jerusalem?
I'm sorry, Tony?
Have you been to Jerusalem?
We just came back.
So tell me about what's down, what kind of places you visited?
Well, we visited a lot of the people in Jerusalem, Tony, and I'm glad that you asked. If you come back on June the 12th, you're going to hear all about it.
I just wanted to know.
Yeah, come back on June the 12th, and you're going to hear some of the activists who traveled with me talk all about it.
I just wanted to know that.
Good. Thanks, Tony. Vic, good to see you here tonight, man.
Yeah, it's good to see you.
Say hi to Kathleen for us.
Well, you'll have to pay me, but that's all right. No, I know you can't. There's no way in an hour or in a week you can talk solid and cover every little point that happens along this whole path. But do you see that the entire, because one of the things that I thought you might include, and we will at some other future time, is the guilt that America went through in not allowing the Jews into the country during World War II, and how that played into our collective consciousness.
Well, there's no question, right?
I mean, it's just another aspect.
Well, no, that's a good point. There's no question that, so Vic asked, why did he thought maybe I might include Western guilt over the Holocaust as one of the reasons that America so supports the state of Israel. And I mean, absolutely. Absolutely. Western guilt plays a large role. I was focused on this idea of American civil religion, but you're right. The Israel lobby, we could have talked about them more. Western guilt, we could have talked more about the resources that Israel's trying to garner from Palestinians, the gas fields out in the Mediterranean, et cetera. So, yeah, there are other things we could have talked about.
Kind of a question in regards to what's transpired, let's say, since the inauguration as far as our foreign policy. It seems in this country, the current or the momentum seems to be going back to a very conservative and nationalistic type attitude. What is the weakness? What's burdening the liberal view right now? Is it the far left?
Say a little bit more. I'm not quite.
Well, it seems like there's a momentum or a push towards a more conservative country right now. And I think part of the problem may be the far left as far as the liberal aspect. A lot of people are being turned off by the woke and by the DEI. Is there going to be a point where there's a common sense merging of that?
Well, I want to give me just a second here. Those of you who know me know I'm kind of schwaffling. You might get what I'm schwaffling. There's no doubt that there's a move to the right, but I'm not even sure that. I mean, in the old days, right? In the old days, there was always this sort of pendulum, right, between conservatism and progressivism. And we always kind of found our way back and forth, right?
That was a working relationship.
Yeah, today, it's a whole different ball game today, because the current occupant of the White House doesn't care about conservatives, doesn't care about liberals, in my view. This is a man who is about self-aggrandizement and taking and garnering for himself as much wealth and power as possible. He doesn't give a tinker's damn about woke or DEI or anything. He's a puppet being used by the authors of Project 2025 and these others who have a theocratic understanding. What I painted tonight. Understanding of America and its mission in the world. So, but you're right that there's a move by these folks. So if you separate Mr. Trump from the folks who are manipulating him and using him, it's even scarier than we think, because once he's gone, these people are still around. And so, I mean, you're welcome to disagree, but I don't think we're woke enough. I don't think we see. I think that people on the left are being too timid. I think that we need to embrace, not run from the center. I mean, not run from the left, but. And I know some of my progressive friends would disagree with me on this too. But this idea of, well, we've got to kind of try to mollify the centrists in order to win elections. But let's just say it this way. I'm not yet convinced. I'm not willing to walk out on a limb on this one, but I'm not yet convinced that that's the way to go. Yeah, Paul, and then David.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that imagery up, because if Trump is gone, now it is Trump. If he's gone tomorrow, there is still 78 million other voters. Our city council is controlled by one party. Our council, our state, our federal government, basically, we are living in a one-party state. And if the midterm elections, which I don't, we have a history in this country that whoever's in the White House, the minority party wins the House. I'm not totally convinced that the Democrats are going to win in the midterms. That the trajectory, is that either we have to figure out how we're going to live in a one-party state and survive and thrive. I mean, I just feel like Americans are under an illusion that somehow this is all going to pass. There's a trajectory that's been planned out for years since Reagan.
Here's my problem. And I mean, I'm in the confessionals now, so it's just between you and me.
Speak into the mic.
No, really, it's not your problem. I don't think it's my problem. And that is that we live within this two-party, system. And so, of course, I align on a certain side. But, I mean, Democrats are a real problem. Like I just said, I don't think, the system, we got a system here, and there's two sides within this system. I think the system is bad, So yeah, when I go to a voting booth, I've got two choices. So I on the one hand, I'm living in this system. So I got to make a decision within this system. On the other hand, the system is a system of domination and empire and neoliberalism and all the rest that's screwing up the world and keeping people poor and all the rest. So I think that the system needs to be overthrown. So, but that's my problem. I would imagine that's not universally accepted even by my progressive friends, So, I got to struggle, and especially then if I'm saying that I'm a follower of Jesus, then that just even ups the ante for me. It ups the ante for me in terms of revolution. David?
A civic creed is supposed to promote unity.
Say that again, please.
A civic creed is supposed to generate unity. Your very first statement in your notes. A sense of unity, purpose, and optimism. We commonly today refer to our society as divided. Divisiveness. Is this divisiveness because we no longer have a pervasive, influential civic creed?
Well, you put your finger on it.
What?
You put your finger on it.
Repeat the comment.
Oh yeah, sorry. David says that a civic religion is supposed to create unity. And we say commonly that society today, America, is divided more than ever. Does this mean that we don't have a common civic faith anymore? When you're such a youthful guy, Dave, so you may not remember this, but when I was a boy, we had the so-called, Judeo-Christian ethic, right? And more or less in the early 1900s up through the 60s more or less, we shared a common kind of language. I mean, schools, taught certain things, families, for the most part, right? I mean, there was a certain way of understanding. If I would have talked about Abraham or Joseph or Jesus, most people in the country would have at least, whether they were Jewish, Christian, secular, Hindu, I mean, most people would have known the kind of common language. There was sort of a general American narrative, an American story. By the way, I say that, that was kind of a privileged point of view, though, wasn't it? Because there were a lot of people of color and others who were omitted from that story. Now with the benefit of hindsight, we go back and we think, oh my God, we omitted all these folks. But anyway, a common sort of way of looking at the world. But with immigration and all the rest, right? America, we used to call it the great melting pot. Well, you all know, right? And so everybody kind of melted together, and you'd have this everybody learning English, common cultures. Well, it was never all that way, but sort of, but never really. Well, now, of course, we prioritize, this diversity and multiculturalism, and we celebrate it all as we should, right? But what has that done then? We don't have a common narrative. When I served as, you mind a personal story? When I served as interim minister for a year at the Unitarian Universalist congregation here in Fort Wayne, that place should be booming because you don't have to be a Christian to go there. You can kind of have your different value systems, but they share a common kind of liberal religious sort of belief, right? A humanism, and yet never really kind of figured out their common narrative, right? Their common narrative. The same thing with America, right? Jefferson thought that within a generation of his lifetime, in the late 1700s, the vast majority of America would have been Unitarian Universalists. Never happened. Because there's not a singular narrative, a civic faith that binds us together. And so now, in this postmodern world, what's one of the marks of postmodernism? There is no central unifying narrative. Well then, we celebrate that, and yet,
We don't have them.
and yet, what binds us together as one then, What is it? And so it's a real conundrum, and we're we're like 50 years in, but in the historical time frame, right, that's yesterday, right? So we're still trying to figure out, Dave, exactly, well, what is it that binds us together if we don't have this, if we have multiple narratives? Is there something that's going to bind us together as one nation? And we don't know what that is yet. What we do know is that we look to things like international law. We look to things like mutual respect for each other, those kind of things. But at the end of the day, democracy is based on trust. It's based on norms. And and I've often been saying lately, forgive this little homily, but I've been saying lately that if you can't shame someone, and if they don't give a damn about the law, well then, right, then all bets are off, right? Normally, so the law provides certain boundaries, but also shaming, right? Even when you're pushing the bounds of the law, you can, shame kind of helps keep people within boundaries. But if you can't shame someone, well then, what the heck? So all bets are off. So that's a long, rambling answer, Dave, to what you were asking. Next, please. Yeah, Tim?
Well, it's really an important time to be a peace activist. We have a great opportunity. We need more people rallying on Tuesday from 5 to 6 o'clock. A really positive street response. I think people understand what's happening, and there really is a genocide, people are starving, and, we're in total control. Trump could call Bibi and say, feed the babies, he could do it any moment. So we have a great opportunity, and don't want to fill the moment. It's just an hour, and, got a lot of good signs, and I think it's, worth doing.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, you've been very faithful for the last 20 months. Thanks. Yeah, Terry, please.
The unifying idea that we seem to have forgotten is the motto of the United States, E pluribus unum, and to me, that's the beauty of this country and the strength of this country. And I mean, the DEI aspect is E pluribus unum. And that is in fact the motto of the United States, the founding motto. So, let's get back to it.
Yeah.
And I don't know why the Democrats can't think about that for a minute.
And how to turn it into a winning political strategy. We talked about that this morning a little bit, didn't we? Yeah, Todd, please. Thanks, Terry.
Michael, back to the whole concept, I like the fact that you did illustrate that we do have and have had two separate civil religions that have competed differently over different points in time. So can we take away some hope that for 250 years there has been this thread of a very positive, progressive, whatever you want to call it, civil religion that has produced some good things and provided some opportunities for others and some, for example, while all of that was occurring at the St. Louis World Fair, that was a time that we were openly inviting, accepting immigrants into our country that were being persecuted, that were being religious, escaping poverty and so forth. So we have both histories, I think, and it's just a matter of really trying to figure out how to get back to the more proper, in my mind, and I think all our minds, civil religion.
Absolutely. This seems to be the dominant one, the one that I painted tonight. However, had I not wanted to inflict more of Michael's path on you tonight, we could have teased out this second one a little bit more tonight, right?
There's hope there. Yeah.
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, to just build on what you were saying, Todd, the Parliament of the World Religions held in Chicago right near the same time of the St. Louis World's Fair. Swami Vivekananda from India, the first Hindu invited to, who traveled throughout the United States, establishing various Vedanta centers throughout the United States. I was one of the students of his theological grandson, Chetanananda in St. Louis. But he established these various Vedanta centers throughout the United States, traveled all around the country after the Parliament of World Religions and others. And by the way, the Parliament of World Religions still exists in Chicago today. It's based out of the Baha'i Temple in northern Chicago. But anyway, that's just an example. But you're right, immigration swelled at the early 20th century, right, in the early 1900s, and throughout the first part of the 20th century. So absolutely. How can we talked about this morning, right? How can we build a winning political strategy around, I get you're an expert in the economic sphere. And so I always, learn from you when you talk about these things, Todd, but how can we focus on, jobs and the economics while at the same time build a winning strategy around diversity and equity and inclusivity and all the rest, the things that are the moral, social issue, not that economics is, but you understand what I'm saying. And so, yeah, it's really important. And there is a story to tell. That was your point.
Well, it should give us hope.
Absolutely.
We wouldn't be here as a country 250 years later if it had not been for a very positive, very open civil religion.
Well, the Civil War was fought over these very things, right? The Civil War was fought.
It hasn't been solved.
Somebody else, we got time for maybe another question. Yeah, David.
If you look at your outline,
Yeah, stop doing that. Because then I got to defend it somehow.
for the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, you exemplified your presentation with a lot of clergy.
Yeah, my God, what are you going to, yeah.
When you get to the 20th century, you quote people associated with the 1904 World's Fair, Edward Said, most American citizens who have a romanticized Sunday school view of the world. And then you went on to presidents and senior government officers. This suggests to me that what is missing today in terms of generating and sustaining a civic creed, and I'm not trying to suggest what that creed should be, what its content should be, is that we don't have an institution other than government or the public forum that might create and sustain a civic creed, but that doesn't have the same kind of influence because it tends to be partisan, as opposed to a dominant institution, which for 2 or 3 centuries, perhaps the church was as influential or more influential than government.
Yeah, in those early days, right, the
Yes.
religious leaders and political leaders kind of overlapped, didn't they?
Yes.
Probably in my lifetime, well, obviously, right, there's not going to be this unanimity.
No.
And when we talk about a civic creed, but it's sort of a mood of the nation or a vision that most people sort of accept. And I guess in my lifetime, the closest that I've seen it would have been the current occupant of the White House is really one of the most consequential figures in my lifetime, in just sort of a horrible, terrible way. But you can't get you can't get around. But the other, Barack Obama, who painted a powerful, inclusive vision that captured even Indiana in his first election, right? Indiana went Democrat. I mean, how often has that happened? I don't know, but doesn't happen often, does it? So it is possible, and it can happen with leaders and others outside of traditionally religious circles. It can happen in government. You wonder, but you're right. What I liked about what you said, Davis, it wasn't so much about an individual, but about institution. And so where can we find that to take place? One of the places that has been co-opted in the last number of years has been the judicial system, right? The courts. It used to be kind of a place, even though there were partisans, right, and all the rest, you could kind of count on the courts to kind of follow the rule of law. Wouldn't you expect? I mean, but even that anymore, right? Even that anymore. Sadly, and then I'll stop. There were only two. There have been some recent polling, Pew and Gallup and others, about the most trusted institutions in America today. I go into this in a sermon a couple of months ago, and the only two that had over 50%, small business, and the military. That tells you something about the state of our country today. Thanks, everybody, for coming out tonight.